Scary Appalachian Reddit Stories. The Appalachian Horror. I grew up in southern Appalachia, in western North Carolina, 30 minutes outside of the town of Asheville. The hills and hollows of the Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest mountains in the world, with some of the rock formations dating back over 1 billion years. That quite literally means they were here before there were terrestrial animals. As with most things that have been on the earth for a long time, there are inexplicable anomalies, both benevolent and malevolent. For example, the Brown Mountain Lights. Never in my life have I felt threatened or uneasy when witnessing them from Wiseman's view. They're neither good nor evil, they just are. On the benevolent side, sometimes when you walk through an abandoned old church up near Mom and Dad's property line, you can feel good, warm, and happy energy. It's like the first warm day of summer when the sunshine is not too hot but not too cold. Well, this story is not about one such anomaly. It's about something that was definitely malevolent. About a decade ago, I was in night school up at AB Tech, going to school for automotive mechanics. I would go into class about 2 p.m. after I got off my part-time job and would end up getting home about 10:30 p.m., depending on traffic. Every night, I drove the same road in my old 1973 W200 Dodge pickup. Some nights, it would get rather boring, and I would take a different route, jump off the I-40, and drive the back roads. On this particular evening, I decided to just stay on I-40 because I wanted to go home and go to bed. It was Thursday, and there was no class on Friday, so I wanted to get in bed early so I could get into the woods and go hiking early the next morning and watch the sun come up. As I jumped off I-40 onto the exit where my parents lived, the night seemed to get darker, and none of the animals that I could hear through my roll-down windows made any more noise. The cabin of my truck became smaller and smaller, and my breathing quickened. I've never faced any kind of anxiety in my life, but at that moment, something felt off. There was no way I could put my finger on what it was. I came to a stop on the exit ramp, turned to go down the road, and happened to notice that the gas station off the exit where Mom and Dad lived had no lights on. It was a 24-hour truck stop and always had lights on, but I didn't think about it again after noticing. I just chalked it up to the power being out. But I could not shake the feeling that something was definitely askew. I slowly shifted through all my old truck's gears, not wanting to make any more noise than an old pickup already did. I leaned over my steering wheel to look up at the moon through the windshield, and there were barely any stars visible, which was way out of the ordinary. If you've ever been to Appalachia, primarily the sparsely populated areas where I'm from, you can see the Milky Way on clear nights. An absence of stars back home is only due to cloud cover. Whatever in the hell went on in this particular night, as I rounded a particularly sharp left-hand curve and chugged through a straight stretch before the next right-hander, I looked at the ancient decaying barn I always gazed at when riding that stretch of road and thought about how long that thing had been there, and how many advancements in civilization it had seen. For the split second that my gaze wandered, a very large, sickly-looking dog ran out in front of my truck, no more than 10 feet in front of me. Old Betsy was a good truck, but she didn't stop well. Thump thump, I heard the fence posts I had left in my truck bounce up out of my bed and then back into it as I slid to a stop. My first thought was, oh God, now I have to go tell these neighbors that I ran over their dog. That kind of thing doesn't go real far with people around here. It can really set them off, depending on the dog and the person. As I sat there, breathing in the smell of burning rubber, something else found its way into my nose, the stench of rotting flesh. It's not a smell you ever forget once you've smelled it the first time. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. I just chalked it up to some rotting roadkill nearby. Finally, I thought to myself, let me go check and see who this dog belongs to. I pushed my clutch in, shifted to reverse, and as I looked at my rearview mirror, illuminated by the haunting glow of my reverse lamps, was the same dog. Only it wasn't on 4 legs anymore. It had stood up like a man well over 10 feet tall. Only then did it dawn on me that the front of my truck was every bit of 5 feet tall, and this dog was every bit of 5 feet tall at the shoulder on all 4s. As it turned its head to look in the direction of my truck, I caught only a glimpse of this creature. It was not a dog. It was not a man. It was somewhere in between and, at the same time, entirely separate altogether. Its skin hung loose off of its emaciated, thin frame like a raccoon. Bits of matted fur, dirt, and mud clung to its legs like a disease. The right arm seemed a little longer than the left. They both hung abnormally low in relation to either animal this creature seemed to be. As it regained its senses, it turned and looked into the mirror like it knew exactly where I was sitting. The face was that of a man's, but the very edges of its face seemed not to be totally defined. It seemed to move and change like something you would see at a cellular level in a scientific documentary. There were no eyes, but only sockets where eyes should have been. No hair, and the skin that was dripping off its face was a cold, lifeless gray color. The nose was short and shoved into its face like a bulldog, but the teeth still haunt me. It was definitely carnivorous, and in true deform of the rest of its unnatural look, many of the teeth didn't seem to be arranged in a natural way in its mouth. They seemed to fill and spill forth from the indefinable face, almost like they knew the horror they occupied and were searching for a way out. It stared through my life, into my eyes, and past my soul. It seemed like an eternity, but it could not have been more than 5 seconds that I sat there, paralyzed. A light came on at a house next to the road, causing the creature to snap its gaze in that direction and tear off into the woods on its back 2 legs like a man. I jammed my old truck in first gear and roasted tires all the way through first, snatched onto second gear, and drove as fast as I could home. When I got to the house, both of my parents were asleep. I went downstairs into my bedroom and loaded every firearm I possessed and locked all the doors. I couldn't wake them up. Who the hell would believe that at 10:30 on a Thursday night? The basement was eerily quiet that night. Even their dogs, that got up to raise hell at outside animals at all hours of the night, were dead silent. The whole post and beam house didn't even creak or pop that night, as was usual. At around 3 a.m., I started to finally get drowsy, and as I went to lay my head down to get some sleep so I could still attempt to go hiking the next morning, I smelled the stench of death again. It was faint at first, but it was definitely there. I thought to myself, I'm just going crazy. None of that was real. But as I dwelled on it, it became more and more noticeable until it filled the entire basement. My dad has a home office in the basement with 2 large glass doors that face Pisgah National Forest, an impenetrable 500,000-acre woods. I finally worked up the courage to walk out of my bedroom and into the basement living room with my little tactical 12-gauge loaded flashlight on. I covered the flashlight with my hands so as not to make my presence known until need be, and as I turned right out of the living room into my father's office, I shined the light through the glass doors. At the edge of the woods, there stood the creature. It was motionless. It stared right into the light, unafraid, with those soulless sockets void of eyes. I quickly covered my tactical light, ran into the living room, flipped on the outdoor floodlights, and to my surprise, it was no longer standing at the edge of the woods but between the house and the edge of the woods, still motionless. I swung the door open and fired every round I had in its direction. I must have scored a couple of hits because it screeched an unearthly scream like that of a woman being slaughtered as it took off into the woods. The dogs went crazy. Mom and Dad woke up, asking me what the hell was going on. I told them that a bear had gotten to the trash and I was scaring it away. They didn't believe me, but I knew they wouldn't believe the truth either. I didn't sleep that night or any time until the following Sunday. Everything seemed to return to normal. I didn't think about that creature again until I met my wife about 6 years later. Her mother's house sits at the mouth of the holler, no more than 4 or 5 miles up the road from my mother and father's, up on the side of the holler. There are kennels for her brother's hound dogs, no longer in use and haven't been in years. But the fence is still there, and the concrete pad is still there. It's a thing of great use when he needs to quarantine an animal. Her Great Pyrenees had gotten into a tussle with a raccoon, which, of course, he destroyed. But his rabies vaccination had lapsed, so we had to keep him quarantined for a time. It didn't bother him. He kind of liked solitude. This particular night, as we were coming home from a movie date in the neighboring town, was the last night of quarantine for him. So, we walked up the last trail using our phone flashlights to get to the kennel, and there he sat, patiently waiting, tail wagging, happy to see us. We put him on a leash and started walking back to the house with him. As we were walking back through the darkness, I started to feel the same feeling I had felt that night I hid from the creature in my truck. I didn't say anything so as not to alarm my wife, and then the smell came wafting in the breeze. She jokingly asked me, "My God, what did you eat? You stink!" I half-assed laughed, not being able to fully appreciate the joke for the horrors that raged within my mind. She immediately caught on and asked me what was wrong, to which I could only reply, "I'll tell you later." She grew up in the woods and around hunting and things of that nature her whole life, so she knew what I meant. She knew we were being watched by something. When we could see the lights of the house from the trail to the kennel, we heard it. There came barking from the kennel that sounded just like the Great Pyrenees we had on a leash next to us. It was a perfect imitation. The Pyrenees, being a guardian dog, immediately sensed that something was wrong and turned to face the danger, belting out deep barks and growls in that direction. I don't know if you've ever had to drag a 150-pound dog, but it sucks, and it's no easy task. I'm 6 feet tall and 240 pounds, and it was all I could do to get him back to the house. The barking never ceased the entire time we were running towards the house. In fact, it seemed to grow closer and closer until it seemed it was coming from inside my own head. Her mother heard the commotion and flipped the floodlights on as we made it into the fence of the yard, and I caught a glimpse of something coming to a dead stop at the end of where the light reached, wheeling around and tearing back into the darkness. My wife looks at me and goes, "You want to tell me what the hell that was?" To which I replied, "Yes, let's go inside." I told her the story, and she listened intently, hanging on every word. Her family came from a long line of granny witches and other supernatural healers of the Appalachians, so her older sister came over the next morning with some herbs and chants to bless the property and to ward off evil. I suggested we go up to the dog kennels and do them as well. When we got to the kennels, they were completely destroyed. The very concrete foundation was cracked, and the chain-link fence was torn off its posts. The dog houses were destroyed, and the place reeked of the stench that followed the creature. My wife's older sister just went about her business like normal, blessed the place, burned some herbs, and led us back onto the property. When we got in the house, she wheeled about us suddenly and instructed us very firmly to never go into the woods after dark, not until this thing left me alone. To make a long story short, my wife joined the military, and she ended up getting stationed in Delaware. Well, as someone who's lived around fairly large mountains and endless wilderness his entire life, Delaware is pretty terrible. At least that was my thought when we first moved into the middle of a 50,000 plus population city. Fortunately though, it didn't take us long to find a house in a sleepy little community further south. We purchased the house and moved in with haste. We were both very grateful and glad to be out of the city and into a rural setting again. The land in Delaware seems lifeless in comparison to Appalachia. The sparsely populated woods don't possess any energy that goes on one way or another. The ground doesn't seem to be alive like it is in Appalachia. Having not thought about the creature in a long time, I resumed my staying outside after dark and playing with her dogs in a rather large yard that borders a small patch of woods. Well, last night, I went outside to play with the dogs, and as dark set in, I'd built a decent-sized fire in my fire pit and consumed some good old-fashioned Appalachian Mountain cough syrup from a mason jar. Just as the fire was dying down, my American bulldog tore off towards the woods. He has a habit of running off to go on adventures, so my immediate instinct was to chase him down in the yard and tackle him so he could not get away. As I tackled his 110-pound ass to the ground and threw him in the fireman's carry over my shoulders, I heard him begin to bark, only the bark was not coming from him. The only sound coming from him was a deep, rumbling growl, a noise I've never heard him make. It was a threatening noise. Something was definitely wrong. And as I ran with him on my shoulders back to the house, the stench of death again began to fill the air. The two other dogs must have caught wind of what was happening and met me at the back door, which I threw open, slammed shut, locked, and again loaded my firearms. How the hell could this thing have followed me 650 miles up here? As I flipped my floodlights on at the back side of my house, several of the bushes and small trees at the forest edge were still shaking, like something had just run through them. My dogs went crazy all night, barking and howling and attempting to get out the windows. I didn't sleep a bit. I don't think I will for a while. I know for sure I won't be in the woods after dark ever again in my life. Not until this thing is gone. Blues with Bear. I'll share a short story inspired by a long experience involving sensitive matters. Once I was with a girl at sunset on the summit of Big Snake Mountain, and the area was far from anyone. We decided to walk up the trail leading to the peak. Behind the car, I stepped into a strange patch of mud filled with unusual brown water. I pointed out its odd color to the girl, then we started walking. After a short while, the girl began to feel scared and went back to the car. Inside the car, we started making out while lying in the front seats, and she had her hand resting on the window. I felt an odd sensation in my back, a feeling that had happened before when someone was behind me, so I told her to pull her hand in, which she did. A few minutes later, I felt the same sensation again, but this time it felt more urgent. I rolled up the window, but being a lovesick teenager, I continued making out. A few minutes later, it felt like someone had stuck a live wire into my back. I sat up, started the car, and drove back down the mountain. The girl obviously looked confused and asked me what was wrong. I replied that something wasn't right, though I didn't know exactly what. We returned to my parents' house, and everyone reassured us that the family was fine. Calming down a bit, we had some dinner and then decided to leave. After opening the car door for her, I walked around the back of the car. As I did, I glanced at the rear of the car and saw fingerprints the same color as the mysterious mud. The last one was over the back window, and it was clear that someone had been watching us while inching their way toward the driver's side window. When I saw the fingerprints, it was like being struck by lightning. I knew what had happened. Chills ran all over me. I got her out of the car, and as soon as she saw the prints, she understood too. This story is the absolute truth, so help me God, and I will never forget it. Otto, the mysterious octopus. My name is Otto. I'm from Illinois, and I love Kid Mountains. The mountains are in my blood, and there's no place more beautiful on earth. My grandfather and many generations of my family before him were from Bunn County in West Virginia. Generally, the introduction isn't very important, but it explains why I'm here. This story doesn't entirely take place in Kid Mountains, but it could have easily ended there. A few years ago, a friend of my parents paid me to pick up their daughter from the city of Boston and bring her back to Chicago, because she has a mild disability and missed several buses they had booked for her. The drive to Boston was relatively uneventful. I got pulled over for a broken headlight, slept in my car at a rest stop, and woke up in western Pennsylvania to a misty mountain sunrise. I reached Boston. The traffic was terrible, and there was nowhere to park, but eventually I found my friend. She loaded her stuff into my trusty car, and we were off. Everything was going smoothly until we decided to stop and rest again in the western mountains of Pennsylvania. Initially, we chose a Walmart parking lot so we could get food, access a bathroom, and if anything happened to us, there would be cameras. But there were a few shady cars that seemed to take interest in us, so we decided to push westward and sleep at a rest stop instead. We tried that. When we arrived, we had some snacks and chatted until it got dark so we could safely go to sleep. But then I noticed something. There was a car sitting in the parking lot of the rest stop that eerily resembled one of those shady cars we'd seen earlier. A newer Jeep brand SUV, white. I debated for a few minutes whether we should worry about it since there are probably tons of people who drive those, before deciding to keep pushing west. Exhausted, barely able to drive, potentially paranoid, but motivated to find somewhere safe to sleep, we eventually found another Walmart and parked somewhere distant from the entrance but not so far that we were invisible. We talked, chatted, and were almost asleep when another white Jeep Compass pulled up right next to us. I saw his eyes, and I'll never forget them. They were cold but full of hatred. Barely awake, I slammed the transmission from park to drive and floored it, heading straight for the highway. Eventually, we decided to exit and try to lose him by zigzagging and changing roads, heading southwest instead of due west as he probably presumed we were doing. After daylight broke, we found ourselves in a small town with a busy Wendy's or McDonald's or something, where we finally got some rest. That night, I was either extremely paranoid, which is entirely possible, or we were followed for well over 100 miles. Either way, it was the most terrifying thing to happen to me in the mountains so far.